The rain battered the small city bus station, transforming the cracked asphalt into a shimmering pool that reflected the flickering neon of a half-dead sign. Sarah, barely 24, stood under the station's rusted overhang, her coat offering scant protection against the biting late autumn wind. In her trembling hand was a single bus ticket to a job interview an hour away, a faint lifeline to pull her from the edge. Tucked in her pocket, her last $15, a crumpled bill she'd been saving for a hot meal after the interview, a small act of defiance against the hunger that had become her constant companion. Sarah's eyes flicked to the schedule, bored, her pulse quickening as she counted the minutes until her bus arrived. She was so close to a chance at something better, something stable. Then, a voice, soft but insistent, cut through the rain's drone. "Excuse me." Sarah turned, her heart jolting, to see a man standing a few feet away. His name, she'd later learn, was Thomas. His worn jacket was soaked, the shoulders darkened by rain, and his dark hair stuck to his forehead in uneven clumps. "I lost my wallet," he said, his voice low, tinged with a shame that made Sarah's chest tighten. "I just need $15 for a ticket home. I'll pay you back, I promise, please." The words hung between them, fragile as the mist rising from the platform. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her pocket, fingers brushing the bill that represented her last shred of security. She studied him, noting the way his hands shook, not just from cold but from something deeper, a quiet despair that echoed her own. He didn't push, didn't plead further, just stood there, as if bracing for the rejection he'd likely faced all day. Sarah's mind screamed to walk away, to protect what little she had left. But another voice, softer, older, rose within her father's, from years ago, when he'd given their last loaf of bread to a neighbor in need. "Kindness comes back, Sarah," he'd said, his smile worn but certain. She didn't believe in miracles, not anymore, not after the hospital bills and the foreclosure threats. Yet something in Thomas's eyes, a flicker of hope beneath the exhaustion, held her there. Her fingers curled around the bill, hesitating. What if he was lying? What if this was the mistake that broke her? But what if he was telling the truth? What if this was the moment she chose to be more than her circumstances? Her heart thudded, her reckless courage stirring. "I don't know why I'm doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she pulled the bill from her pocket. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers brushing his cold ones. "Just get home safe." Thomas's eyes widened, a flash of disbelief crossing his face, as if he'd expected her to turn away like everyone else. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking, raw with gratitude. He clutched the bill like it was more than money, like it was a lifeline. Then, with a quick nod, he turned and vanished into the rain, his figure swallowed by the haze as the distant rumble of a bus approached. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, the cold sinking deeper now, her pocket empty. Her bus pulled in, its headlights cutting through the grey, and she boarded, her damp shoes leaving faint prints on the floor. She sank into a seat by the window, the glass streaked with rain, blurring the world outside. She had no money now, no safety net, just a ticket and a strange, stubborn spark of warmth from giving when she had nothing left to give. As the bus lurched forward, carrying her toward an uncertain future, Sarah couldn't know that this moment, this single act of trust in a stranger, was the first ripple in a wave that would reshape her life. Sarah stepped off the bus into a city that felt colder than the one she'd left, the rain now a persistent drizzle that soaked through her worn sneakers. Her interview was in 30 minutes, across a sprawling downtown she barely knew, and her empty pocket weighed heavier than the damp coat clinging to her shoulders. The $15 she'd given to Thomas at the bus station haunted her, not just the loss of it, but the reckless hope that had driven her to hand it over. She'd meant to buy a sandwich after the interview, a small act of self-care to celebrate even trying, but now her stomach growled with a hollow ache that matched the uncertainty in her chest. The streets were a maze of hurried pedestrians and honking cabs, their indifference pressing against her as she navigated unfamiliar sidewalks. Her map app useless with her phone's battery dead. She was late, 20 minutes late, by the time she reached the sleek office building, its glass doors reflecting a version of herself she barely recognized. Hair matted, eyes shadowed, clothes damp and rumpled. The receptionist's smile was thin. Her voice clipped as she informed Sarah the interviewer had moved on to another meeting. "I'm sorry, I got delayed," Sarah stammered, but the woman was already typing, her attention elsewhere. "Please, can I wait? I'll stay as long as it takes. The receptionist shook her head, her pity sharp as a blade. You'll need to reschedule. Sarah's throat tightened, but she nodded, turning away before the tears could spill. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a biting wind, slicing through her coat as she stood on the sidewalk, watching people rush past. Watch, purposeful. She felt like a ghost, unseen, unmoored, her last chance slipping through her fingers. Like the rain, by the time she made the long trek back to her tiny apartment, a single room with peeling paint and a shared bathroom down a flickering hallway, exhaustion had settled into her bones. The landlord was waiting, his arms crossed, his face set in a familiar scowl. Rent's overdue, Sarah. 3 days. I know, I'm trying, she said, her voice small. You said that last week, he replied. I've got someone else ready to take the room tomorrow. She opened her mouth to plead, but the words died. What was the point? That night, she packed her life into a worn backpack, 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, a cracked photo of her father smiling in better days, and a dog-eared journal where she used to scribble dreams before they felt like taunts. She left the key on the counter and stepped into the night, the city's hum a cruel reminder of her isolation. With no money for a bus or a shelter bed, she wandered until she found a park, its benches slick with rain but quiet under the cover of ancient oaks. She curled up on one, her backpack as a pillow, the cold metal biting through her layers. The stars were hidden by clouds, but the darkness felt personal, like it was swallowing her whole. Sarah's mind drifted to Thomas, to the way his eyes had softened when she handed him the money. Had she been a fool? That $15 could have bought her a night in a cheap motel, a meal, a moment of dignity. Yet, as she shivered under her coat, a small part of her clung to the memory of his gratitude, the way he'd looked at her like she was more than her circumstances. It was a fleeting warmth, drowned out by the reality of her situation. The next morning, she woke stiff and sore, her breath visible in the dawn chill. She tried to move forward, visiting a job center where a bored clerk handed her a stack of flyers for jobs she wasn't qualified for. Most required an address, a phone number, things she no longer had. She walked to a library, hoping to charge her phone, but the outlets were taken, and the security guard's glance told her she didn't belong. By evening, she avoided shelters, the shame of being seen too heavy, and returned to the park, choosing a different bench, as if that could change her reality. Each night blurred into the next, the city's rhythm indifferent to her struggle. She scavenged half-eaten pastries from cafe trash bins, her hands shaking as she forced herself to eat. The word hope felt like a betrayal, a promise that had never been kept. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the park was still and the world seemed to pause, Sarah's thoughts returned to that rainy bus station. She saw Thomas's face, the way he'd clutched the bill like it was salvation. She wondered where he was, if he'd made it home, if he'd meant it when he promised to pay her back. The thought wasn't about the money, it was about the connection, the brief moment when she'd felt like she mattered. It was a fragile thread, but it kept her from unraveling completely. On the 5th night, as she sat on a bench trying to dry her socks in the fading light, a group of teenagers passed, one tossing a crumpled napkin her way with a smirk. "Get a life," he muttered. Sarah didn't look up, but the words cut deeper than the cold. She was invisible, a shadow in a city that didn't care. As the stars began to peek through the clouds, she hugged her backpack tighter, her father's photo pressed against her chest. She didn't cry, not yet, but the weight of her choices, her losses, her kindness, pressed down harder than ever. Sarah sat on her usual bench, her knees pulled to her chest, her backpack a makeshift shield against the world. Days had blurred into a week since she'd given her last $15 to Thomas, and the city's indifference had worn her down to a shadow of herself. Her stomach was a constant knot of hunger, her clothes stiff with grime, and the ache in her chest was no longer just grief for her father, but a longing for a life that felt human. She'd stopped looking in shop windows, avoiding the reflection of a woman she barely recognized, hair tangled, eyes hollow, hope fraying like the hem of her coat. The park's silence was broken only by the occasional jogger or dog walker, their lives seeming to belong to a different world. Sarah was invisible to them, just another figure on a bench, her story reduced to a fleeting glance. She'd tried to keep moving, visiting job centers and libraries, but without an address or a working phone, every door seemed locked. The weight of her choice at the bus station lingered, a mix of regret and defiance. Had she been reckless, or had she done something that mattered? The question gnawed at her, but it was the memory of Thomas's grateful eyes that kept her from sinking entirely into despair. As the sun climbed higher, casting weak rays through the bare branches, Sarah noticed an elderly woman approaching, her steps deliberate but graceful. She wore a thick wool shawl, its edges frayed but clean, and carried a small canvas bag. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp yet kind, settled on Sarah with a warmth that felt foreign. "You look like you could use something warm," the woman said, her voice soft but steady, as she sat on the bench without waiting for an invitation. Sarah stiffened, her pride bristling, but the woman's gaze held no pity, only a quiet understanding. "I'm fine," Sarah murmured, her voice hoarse from disuse. The woman, who introduced herself as Clara, smiled gently and opened her bag, pulling out a homemade blueberry muffin wrapped in wax paper and a small thermos of chamomile tea. "I always bring extra," Clara said, setting them between them, "in case I meet someone who needs it." Sarah's throat tightened, the offer stirring a memory of her father sharing their last apple with her during a lean winter. His hands rough but his smile steady. She wanted to refuse, to cling to the scraps of her dignity, but the scent of the muffin broke her resolve. Her hands trembled as she took it, the first bite crumbling softly, the sweetness almost painful against her hunger. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Clara didn't push, didn't ask for her story, just sat quietly, sipping from her own thermos. They stayed like that for a while, the silence companionable, the park waking around them. "You know," Clara said after a time, "there's a community center a few blocks from here, on Elm Street. They serve meals, help with job training. They're always looking for volunteers. You seem like someone who might find a place there." Sarah looked at her, wary but curious. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Clara's smile deepened, lines crinkling around her eyes. "Because someone helped me once, a long time ago. It's how we keep going." She stood, brushing off her shawl, and pointed toward the street. "Ask for Maria at the center. Tell her Clara sent you." Then she walked away, her figure blending into the morning light. Sarah sat frozen, the muffin half-eaten in her lap, the thermos warm in her hands. The idea of a community center felt like a lifeline, but it also terrified her. Admitting she needed help meant admitting how far she'd fallen. That afternoon, she found the center, a modest brick building with a faded sign that read Elm Street Haven. Inside, the air smelled of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, a stark contrast to the park's damp chill. Maria, a wiry woman, with a clipboard and a nonsense demeanor, looked Sarah up and down, but didn't flinch at her disheveled state. "Clara sent you?" she asked, her tone softening. Sarah nodded, and Maria handed her an apron. "We're short-handed today. Start by chopping carrots. You eat after the shift." Sarah hesitated, the weight of the apron foreign in her hands. She worked silently, her hands finding a rhythm, the act of doing something for others easing the knot in her chest. The people who came through the line weren't just faces. They were stories: a man who'd lost his job but still joked about the weather, a woman who thanked Sarah for the soup with a trembling smile. By the end of the shift, her feet ached, but her heart felt lighter, as if she'd reclaimed a piece of herself. Maria offered her a cot in the center's emergency shelter for the night, and Sarah accepted, too tired to refuse. As she lay in the dark, the hum of the center around her, she thought of Clara's muffin, of Thomas's gratitude, of her father's voice. Maybe kindness wasn't just a risk, it was a bridge, connecting her to others who'd fallen, who'd risen, who'd kept going. For the first time in weeks, sleep came without fear. The Elm Street Haven Community Center buzzed with the quiet chaos of a late afternoon, the clatter of dishes mingling with murmured conversations as volunteers cleaned up after the lunch rush. Sarah moved through the motions, wiping down tables, her hands steady despite the ache in her legs from hours on her feet. It had been 3 weeks since Clara's muffin and the unexpected refuge of the center. And in that time, Sarah had found a fragile rhythm, volunteering by day, sleeping on a cot by night, her backpack tucked safely under the bed. The work didn't erase the hunger or the uncertainty, but it gave her something to hold on to, a purpose that felt like a lifeline. She'd learned the names of regulars, their stories weaving into her own: a veteran who hummed old jazz tunes, a young mother who always asked for extra bread for her son. Each smile, each thank you, chipped away at the isolation that had defined her days in the park. Yet, beneath it all, the memory of Thomas Lingard, his hazel eyes and trembling hands, a quiet question mark in her mind. Had her $15 mattered, or was it just another loss in a string of them? She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the warm scent of vegetable stew that clung to the air. The bell above the door chimed, sharp and unexpected, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced up, and her heart stuttered. A man stood in the doorway, his tailored coat a stark contrast to the center's worn floors, his dark hair neatly combed, his posture confident yet searching. It was his eyes, those same hazel eyes, now bright with purpose, that stopped her cold. Thomas. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on her, and for a moment, time seemed to pause, the noise of the center fading to a hum. He crossed the room, with steady steps, a faint smile playing on his lips, and Sarah set down her rag, her hands trembling, not from cold, but from the surreal weight of recognition. "Hello," he said, his voice warmer, more assured than the rain-soaked plea she remembered. "Do I know you?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "You do," he said, his smile softening. "You trusted me when no one else would." The words unlocked the memory of that rainy bus station, the crumpled bill, the reckless choice that had left her empty. She stared at him, taking in the polished shoes, the crisp shirt, the man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a community kitchen. "You're him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man from the station." He nodded. "Thomas Reed. I was a mess that day, and you gave me your last $15. Sarah's mind reeled, questions tumbling over each other. "Why are you here?" she asked, folding her arms across her apron, as if to shield herself from the impossibility of this moment. Thomas's expression grew serious, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I came looking for you," he said. "I went back to the station the next day, but you were gone. No one knew your name. I've been checking shelters, centers, anywhere I thought you might be." Sarah blinked, stunned. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Because you changed something for me," he said. "I wasn't just stranded that day. I was testing something myself. Mostly, I'm the founder of the Reed Foundation. We work on community empowerment, education, second chances. I went undercover to understand what it's like to have nothing, to see who notices, who cares. And you did. You saw me when I was invisible." Sarah's heart pounded, the words sinking in. The Reed Foundation, she'd heard of it, vaguely, in news snippets about innovative non-profits, but she'd never connected it to the man she'd helped. "You're saying you're, what, some kind of millionaire?" she asked, half laughing, half disbelieving. Thomas's smile was wry. "Something like that, but that's not the point. The point is, you gave everything you had, no questions asked. That kind of heart, it's what we need at the foundation." Sarah stepped back, her mind spinning. This was too much, too fast. She wasn't a hero. She was just a woman who'd made a desperate choice, one she'd questioned every cold night since. "I don't have anything to offer," she said, her voice tight. "No degree, no address, nothing." Thomas shook his head, undeterred. "You have more than you know. Your story, your resilience, the way you're here helping others when you're barely holding on, that's what matters. I want you to work with us, Sarah, not as a volunteer, but as part of our team. We train you, support you, give you a place to start again." Sarah's breath caught, the offer feeling like a door she hadn't dared imagine, but doubt crept in, sharp and familiar. Was this pity, a debt repaid out of guilt? She looked at him, searching his face for answers. "Why me?" she asked, her voice raw. "Because you're the kind of person who changes lives," he said simply. "You changed mine." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of his words settling over her. She thought of the park, the hunger, the endless rejections, and now this a chance to be seen, to be valued. Her pride warred with her longing, but the warmth in Thomas's eyes, the same gratitude she'd seen in the rain, tipped the balance. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling, but sure. "I'll try." Thomas's smile widened, a spark of hope mirrored in his gaze. "That's all we need," he said. "Let's start there." As he handed her a business card, sleek and embossed with the Reed Foundation's logo, Sarah felt the first stirrings of something new, not just hope, but belief that maybe she wasn't meant to stay lost. The Reed Foundation's headquarters hummed with energy, a renovated warehouse where sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating desks cluttered with plans and walls adorned with photos of smiling faces from community projects. Sarah stepped into this world with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Her first day marked by the weight of a name tag that read Sarah, Program Trainee. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas's unexpected appearance at the Elm Street Haven, and now, at 24, she was no longer just surviving but learning. Her nights on a cot replaced by a small rented room funded by the foundation's stipend. The work was daunting. Training sessions on grant writing, community outreach, and program design filled her days, each task stretching her mind in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her hands, once raw from cold, now turned pages of manuals and typed notes, her hesitance giving way to a quiet confidence. She shadowed coordinators visiting youth shelters and food banks, listening to stories that echoed her own lass resilience, the stubborn will to keep going. Each interaction felt like a mirror, reflecting the woman she was becoming, one who could offer more than a meal but a moment of being seen. Thomas was a constant presence, not as a looming boss but as a guide, his encouragement steady yet never patronizing. He'd share a quick joke over coffee or linger after meetings to ask her thoughts, his hazel eyes holding the same gratitude she'd seen in the rain. Their connection grew in small, unspoken ways, a shared nod during a heated discussion, a quiet walk to the bus stop after a long day. Sarah felt the stirrings of trust, a feeling she hadn't allowed since her father's death, though she kept it at arm's length, wary of how quickly life could unravel. One afternoon, Thomas called her into his office, a cozy space filled with books and a single photo of a younger him with an older woman who resembled Clara. He slid a slim folder across the desk, his expression bright with possibility. "Your first project," he said. "Design something that matters to you. We'll fund it." Sarah opened the folder, her breath catching at the typed proposal inside. A mobile resource van to deliver food, hygiene kits, and job resources to transient communities, people like she'd been, too ashamed or afraid to walk into a shelter. The idea had sparked during a late shift at the center, watching a man hesitate at the door, his pride battling his need. What if help came to them? She'd thought, meeting them where they stood. She looked at Thomas, stunned. "You're serious?" she asked. He nodded, his smile unwavering. "You know what it's like out there. Build something that changes it." Over the next weeks, Sarah threw herself into the project, her days a blur of planning, routes, sourcing supplies, and meeting with a small team of volunteers who believed in her vision. The work was grueling, but it lit a fire in her she hadn't felt in years. She sketched designs for the van, picturing it painted in soft green with open arms, project in bold letters, a beacon of dignity on forgotten streets. The foundation's board approved the prototype, their trust in her, a woman with no degree, no address, just months ago, both humbling and overwhelming. The first time she saw the finished van, its paint gleaming under the lot's floodlights, Sarah's eyes burned with tears. She ran her hand along its side, feeling the weight of her own journey in its curves. The first night it rolled out, she drove to a park she knew too well, where benches had once been her bed. They served over 80 meals, soup, bread, apples, handed out with a conversation, a name remembered, a story heard. A teenage girl with tangled hair pressed a folded note into Sarah's hand, a scribbled thank you that Sarah tucked into her pocket like a treasure. The van became a lifeline, its roots expanding as word spread, volunteers joining from all corners of the city. Sarah stood at its helm, her voice steady as she coordinated, her heart full as she saw faces light up with recognition. Thomas watched from the sidelines, his pride quiet but evident, his presence a reminder of the moment that had started it all. One evening, as they unloaded supplies under a fading sunset, he handed her a coffee, their fingers brushing. "You're building something real," he said, his voice soft, "something lasting." Sarah looked at him, the warmth in her chest, no longer just gratitude but something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. For the first time, she believed she could be more than her past. That her kindness, her $15, had seeded a future she was only beginning to understand. The community garden bloomed with early spring vigor, its rows of sprouting vegetables vibrant against the city's grey backdrop, a testament to the hands that had tilled hope from barren soil. Sarah stood near a budding peach tree, her clipboard tucked under her arm, watching volunteers from the Open Arms Project distribute meals to a crowd gathered for a spring luncheon. The past months at the Reed Foundation had reshaped her. her once tentative steps now sure, as she coordinated routes and trained new volunteers. The mobile van, now a fleet of 3, rolled through the city's forgotten corners, serving thousands. Weekly, each meal a reminder of her own journey from hunger to purpose. The garden event was a celebration of that work, with laughter and music weaving through the air. Children darting between tables, their faces smudged with dirt and joy. Sarah's heart swelled as she spotted a familiar face, a young woman she'd met during her first week at Elm Street Haven, now helping serve soup, her smile brighter than Sarah had ever seen. Yet beneath the day's warmth, a quiet unease stirred. Thomas had been distant all morning, his usual easy humor replaced by a thoughtful silence. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the garden, he approached her under the peach tree, its petals fluttering like soft promises. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but weighted, "I've been offered a chance to lead a new urban outreach initiative in Chicago. The foundation's expanding, and they want me to build it from the ground up." Sarah's breath caught, her clipboard suddenly heavy. "Chicago?" she asked, the word sharp with surprise. He nodded, his hazel eyes searching hers. "It's a big step, but I told them I wouldn't go without asking you to come with me, not just to help, but to lead, to take open arms national." The offer hung between them, dazzling yet daunting, a door to a future she hadn't imagined. She looked around the garden at the volunteers, the families, the city that had held her through her darkest days. This place had been her anchor, its streets teaching her resilience, its people giving her a reason to rise. The thought of leaving felt like betraying a part of herself she'd fought to reclaim. "I don't know," she said, her voice soft but honest. "This city, these people, they saved me. I'm not sure I'm ready to let go." Thomas's expression softened, not with disappointment but with understanding, his hand brushing hers briefly. "I thought you might say that," he said. "It's why I believe in you. You've built roots here, and that's not something to abandon lightly." They sat on a nearby bench, the garden's hum fading as they spoke. Sarah traced the edge of her clipboard, her thoughts tangled. Chicago meant a bigger stage, a chance to touch more lives, but it also meant leaving the community that had become her home. Thomas spoke of their shared vision, of how they could adapt open arms for other cities, but he didn't push, his voice steady with respect for her choice. "I feel like I'm meant to stay," she said finally, her eyes meeting his. "There's more to do here, more people who need this, but I don't want this to end." His smile was small, certain. "It won't. We'll make it work. Different cities, same fight." They planned as the sky turned to dusk, agreeing to weekly calls, shared projects, visits when time allowed. Their connection, forged in a rainy bus station and deepened through months of work, wasn't bound by geography. As they stood to rejoin the event, Clara approached, her shawl catching the evening breeze. Sarah's heart skipped. She hadn't seen her since that morning in the park. Clara's eyes twinkled as she revealed she was Thomas's aunt, the one who'd sent Sarah to Elm Street Haven after hearing Thomas's story of the $15 kindness. "You saw something in her," Clara said to Thomas, "and I had to see it too." Sarah laughed, the pieces of her journey clicking together: the muffin, the van, the man who'd changed her life. As Clara hugged her, Sarah felt the weight of their intertwined paths, a ripple of kindness that had carried her here. Later, under the garden's string lights, Sarah looked at Thomas, his presence a quiet promise. She wasn't losing him. They were planting new seeds, together but apart, their story evolving as the city bloomed around them.